Imagine embarking on a journey spanning thousands of miles, generations of innovation, and the creation of some of the world's most essential foods. Today, we're diving deep into the incredible prehistory of the Americas, revealing the untold story of early explorers who changed the world. Get ready to be amazed. You know, history is all about digging into the past with the best tools we've got. And the more we discover, the more the story changes. In recent decades, thanks to some awesome scientific breakthroughs, we've gotten a better grip on the time way before people wrote things down. So, way back in the day, humanity was hanging out in Africa for about 1 million years. Eventually, they got the itch to explore as humans tend to do. They started moving out, spreading across continents that were connected by land. It's kind of like they were on a giant road trip. These early humans ventured into Europe and Asia, settling down over thousands of years. But when it came to the Americas, they hit a bit of a roadblock. The Americas were cut off by these vast, uncrossable oceans. Sure, you might have heard about Pangaea, where all the continents were one big land mass. But that was way before humans even showed up. By the time we came along, the continents and oceans were more or less in the positions we see today. This isolation of the American continents and some changes in global climate played a big role in our story. It meant that people who eventually made it to the Americas had to adapt to a whole new set of challenges and opportunities. And that's where our journey into America's deep past really begins. It's a history that goes far beyond Columbus or the Vikings. Most people in North and South America, especially outside the United States, have some roots that trace back to those pre-Columbian days. But even if your ancestors came on the Mayflower, on a slave ship, or through Ellis Island, there's a good reason why American prehistory matters to you. First off, the people who settled in the Americas are distant cousins to the folks who made a home in Europe. So we're all kind of related. If you think about it, those early Americans also embarked on one heck of an adventure, making a journey that's right up there with the greatest human treks in history. What's even more fascinating is that these early Americans were like culinary pioneers. They introduced 3 out of the 5 most important foods that we all chow down on today. So, in a way, they had a huge hand in shaping the modern world, the one we're living in right now. Now, you might wonder why a lot of historians tend to gloss over this prehistory stuff. Well, it's because there aren't any written records from those ancient times, and that makes it pretty tough to know exactly what went down back then. But that's where other smarty pants guys like anthropologists, archaeologists, geographers, linguists, and a bunch of other scientists come into play. They help fill in the gaps in the story. The coolest part is that with each passing day, our understanding of the past keeps evolving, thanks to new tools and data. Take our knowledge of human origins, for instance. It's changed quite a bit since the day archaeologists started digging up those ancient bones. The latest scoop is that there were several waves of human migration out of Africa. The most recent wave, the one that ultimately led to us, kicked off about 80,000 years ago. But around 150,000 years ago, something major happened. Some kind of catastrophe drastically reduced the Homo sapiens population in Africa to just a few thousand or maybe even just a few hundred folks. This period lines up with the peak of the Ice Age, so it's likely that shifting climate and changes in vegetation played a part. Scientists are still puzzling over what exactly caused this population crisis. But one thing's for sure, we're all descended from those few hundred survivors. As the climate kept on changing, some of the survivors began moving northward from their original stomping grounds in Central Africa, probably chasing after the critters they hunted for food. So, about 40,000 years ago, there were a bunch of Homo sapiens hunter-gatherers from the group that survived the African population crunch, chilling on the Eurasian plains north of the Black Sea. These are your ancestors if you're of Asian, European, or Native American descent. They had spears, fire, and some teamwork to fend off big, scary predators and were pros at hunting massive animals like woolly rhinoceroses and mammoths. These folks had a knack for adapting to the plains and tundra, giving them an edge when the weather, vegetation, and animal migration patterns started changing again. These changes opened up new habitats all across the Eurasian landmass, stretching from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Our next destination is the post-Ice Age period, where glaciers covered much of the northern hemisphere. And they were so massive that they made some of the world's largest rivers slow to a trickle or even stop altogether. This ice age also led to global sea levels dropping by a whopping 360 feet. For context, if all the ice on Antarctica and Greenland melted today, the oceans would only rise by about half of that, causing a huge global mess. At that time, you could actually walk from Asia to America because the Bering Strait between Siberia and Alaska wasn't very deep, and this land strip that scientists called Beringia stretched for about 1,000 kilometers. This wasn't just some narrow, temporary land bridge. It was a massive, stable landmass that stuck around for a whopping 16,000 years, much longer than recorded history. So, the folks living in Beringia, who we'll call the early Americans, weren't deliberately migrating to the New World. They were just doing what their ancestors had done for countless generations, following game animals and living off the land. These Beringians didn't bring a whole lot with them either, except for some trusty dogs they'd been domesticating from wolves in Central Asia about 30,000 years ago. Genetic evidence tells us that there was a pause in their journey, likely because a wall of ice blocked their way into North America. Climbing a 2-mile-high glacier was probably a no-go. Even if they knew there was something on the other side, it wasn't until about 15,000 years ago, as the ice melted and sea levels rose, that Beringia started to get cut off from Asia. Though there was still a narrow land strip connecting the continents until about 11,000 years ago, it wasn't the smooth, flat terrain the early Americans had known. We don't have the exact date for when a coastal corridor opened up, but by 14,800 years ago, the early Americans had made it to the southern coast of Chile and set up camp at Monteverde. Now, that's quite a trek. Southern Chile is a far cry from Beringia, and the distance between the two ends of the Pan-American Highway, from Prudhoe Bay, Alaska, to Monteverde, Chile, is nearly 30,000 miles. It might have taken the Beringian explorers 1,000 years to make the journey, though we haven't found many camps or settlements along the way just yet. Rising sea levels at the end of the Ice Age might have submerged some of the evidence. Archaeologists at Monteverde uncovered stone tools, scraps of mammoth and llama hides, wooden tent pegs, and a bunch of other plant and animal remains. Around a third of the plants were charred from cooking, showing that these early Americans had a diverse diet with lots of vegetables. Some of the plants came from as far as 600 kilometers away, and they even brought seaweed from the Pacific coast 50 kilometers off. More than half of these plants are still used by the Mapuche for food, medicine, and other things. These early Americans were not only high mobile, but also quick learners when it came to identifying edible plants. This knowledge becomes even more impressive when you consider that as they journeyed southward along the coasts of the Americas, they left behind the Arctic tundra they knew so well and faced entirely new ecosystems. They crossed the equator and encountered tropical weather for the first time in generations. Yet, they seem to have adapted pretty swiftly. These early experts soon began to work their magic, selectively breeding Native American plants into some of the world's most vital crops. Take maize, or what we commonly call corn. It also started in southern Mexico around 9,000 years ago. Central American natives transformed a humble native grass called teosinte into the single-stem, large-eared maize plant we recognize today. How? Well, it took patience and generations of farming. Each year, farmers saved seeds from the best plants with a pumice seed heads. Gradually, these seeds transformed from grassy bits into what we now call ears of corn. The process of selective breeding might have spanned centuries, And along the way, maize plants lost the ability to reproduce by themselves. Modern corn seeds are stuck on their ears, and most won't sprout unless people intervene and replant them. Today, maize is a superstar among crops. It feeds billions and serves as the foundation for energy, plastics, pharmaceuticals, and more. Potatoes, on the other hand, are even older than corn, known as papas. In the Andes Mountains, they were crafted by South Americans between 10,000 and 7,000 years ago in the high-altitude regions of what's now Peru and Bolivia. To this day, Andean markets display hundreds of potato varieties that many outside the region have never laid eyes on. These spuds were tailored for a wide range of uses, and even thousands of years ago, farmers in South America were freeze-drying potatoes for long-term storage, a technique that wouldn't be recorded by Spanish conquistadors until much later. Potatoes were among the first New World treasures brought back to Spain by the conquistadors. European farmers embraced them, and by 1900, potatoes had largely solved Europe's recurring food shortage problem. Economist Adam Smith even highlighted the fact that fields planted with potatoes could feed 3 times as many people compared to wheat. Today, potatoes remain one of the top 5 staple foods worldwide. Let's not forget cassava, native to central Brazil, where it was domesticated some 10,000 to 7,000 years ago. The product of the cassava tree, known as manioc, might only ring a bell to most North Americans in the form of tapioca dessert. But in reality, processed cassava roots are another heavyweight among staple crops. Manioc nourishes billions across Asia and Africa. However, raw cassava roots are toxic, containing cyanide compounds. So before it can be savored, manioc needs a bit of a makeover. Preparing cassava involves grating, milling, fermenting, drying, and roasting the roots depending on what you plan to whip up. As agriculture started to take root, people could say goodbye to the nomadic way of life. So this newfound farming revolution marked the birth of the very first cities. With regular food on hand, populations grew, and soon magnificent cities began to rise. Think about Tiwanaku, perched by Lake Titicaca in the Bolivian highlands. This city was born around 3,500 years ago and housed 30,000 folks. They were clever farmers, using a method called flooded race-field agriculture, and they even built walled terraces on the hilly terrain around the lake. What's impressive is that these Tiwanakans lived at some of the highest altitudes where people have ever settled. Imagine, the lake itself sits 12,500 feet above sea level. During those 12,000 years when the Americas were isolated from the rest of the world, diverse civilizations sprouted. Many of these cultures coexisted, and trade networks crisscrossed entire continents, carrying goods like copper from Upper Michigan, seashells from New England, and pipestone from Minnesota. Cities like Cahokia in Illinois, Machu Picchu in Peru, Chichen Itza in Mexico, and Pueblo Bonito in Colorado are just a few examples of the incredible native cultures that left their mark. So, as we wrap up this extraordinary journey into America's ancient past, remember that the history of our ancestors is not just a tale of survival and migration. It's the foundation of the world we live in today. These early Americans, through their determination and ingenuity, shaped the course of human history. Let's celebrate their legacy and the incredible impact they've had on our modern lives.